of the 2015 class fall lecture series taking place throughout the semester. In this series, we are addressing different issues and aspects regarding Brazil, such as its historical formation, culture, and contemporary dilemmas through an interdisciplinary perspective. You'll find some pamphlets in the back regarding the upcoming lectures and schedule. Further, I encourage you to follow us on the Yale Brazil Lecture Series Facebook page. You may also visit the CLAI's website and our Yale Brazil Club on Facebook to keep up to date on upcoming lectures and events. This accomplishment could not be possible without the continual support of the Council of Latin American and Iberian Studies at the Macmillan Center. Once more, I would like to personally express my gratitude to the Council members, its former chair, Professor Stuart Schwartz, and its current chair, Susan Stokes, and its assistant, Jean Silke and Tricia Connolly. I also thank our co-sponsors, the Latin American Series at the Law School, Bradley Hayes, Yale Brazil Club members, and Shannon Schneider of the Yale Office of International Affairs. All of them have been sincerely helpful in the realization of this lecture series. Professor David Jackson is a member of the Portuguese and Brazilian Literature and Culture at the Yale Department of Spanish and Portuguese. His book includes Machado de Assis, A Literary Life, published by Yale University Press this year. Adverse Genres in Fernando Pessoa, published in 2010. Oxford Anthology of the Brazilian Short Story, published in 2006. And Haroldo de Campos, A Dialogue with the Brazilian Concrete Poet, published in 2005. Professor Jackson is a cellist with several students' orchestras and ensembles at Yale, and also he takes students to Brazil for Yale summer sessions. As you can see, he has deep Brazilian cultural connections. We are glad to have him with us today, and I hope we will have time for a question and answer session after the lecture. Thank you very much, Professor, for accepting our invitation, and now I give the floor to Professor David Jackson.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to accept this invitation, and I'm grateful to the Brazil Lecture Series and all the other sponsors of the presentation. I want to begin by showing a few images for you to keep in mind so that I don't have to interrupt from my talk. This photograph by Mark Verhees is one of the famous photographs of Machado de Assis, which I'm grateful to the Biblioteca Nacional and the Instituto Moreira Salles, and the cover of the book that just came out in May. The first of the images, these images are from the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas, Machado's novel of 1881, and they show his playfulness and his experimentation in terms of the organization of the chapters into the text. This particular passage is when Brás Cubas finds out that he's going to be in love with Virgilia and who Virgilia is. And it's done as if it were a declension from Latin, from the part of the introduction of Virgil's Iliad, of Arms and the Man I Sing, which has then declined, this is by his father, through Virgil to get Virgil, and this is your bride's name is, of course, Virgilia. So this is also a parody on the mock epic, right, presentation of the novel, as well as a curious way of presenting the name of the first namorada. Chapter 55, when Brás and Virgilia are about to get together. This is a chapter with no words whatsoever, only with punctuation, and the old dialogue of Adam and Eve, of course Brás being Adam and Virgilia being Eve. If you follow the punctuation, you can perhaps see how they're getting together. I had to put two different pages together. So we have a final agreement with the two exclamation marks. Wonder what that means right at the end of the chapter. There is a chapter that's just an epitaph, like a tombstone, when the young woman who's been found to be the new wife of Brás Cubas to replace Virgilia, her name is Na Lolo, suddenly dies of yellow fever. And we're not told anything about her death at all. We just have a chapter that's the tombstone here, Limestone of San Gibito. And that's also the first time we ever see her actual name. The playfulness of chapter 136, uselessness. But I'm either mistaken or I've just written a useless chapter. There's this sort of chunk DNA, the kind of filler. It gets us from one point to the other, but highly inventive in terms of, what at the time, experimental techniques in the novel, almost a form of non-writing. And then finally, this wonderful chapter when Ross is thinking of having a political career, but it all doesn't work out, so he writes a chapter about how I didn't get to be the Minister of State, and that's the story. Right? So this will give you then some idea of his playfulness in putting the story and chapters together. Aside from a few life-changing moments, little is known about the biography of Machado de Assis, because aside from his companion of 34 years, Carolina Genovais, an educated woman from Portugal whom he married in 1869, his constant companions were books. Those books make up what I call the world library of Machado de Assis. The library is not just the author's private collection of books, part of which can be found today in the Library of Brazil's Academy of Letters. Rather, a library that includes all the titles that he had heard about or read. His library began in literary circles, theaters, and reading rooms of Rio de Janeiro, where the young author and translator began to devour all that he could find in French and Portuguese literatures. Wide reading prepared the first quarter of a century of his creative work, leading him to rewrite, transform, or appropriate materials he read, as well as the performances he attended, largely opera, covering a wide panorama of authors from different languages and periods. These activities are the source of hundreds of references made to authors and books in his subsequent writings. In the first pages of his novel Posthumous Memoirs of Brás Cubas, for instance, he mentions Sterne, Stendhal, Xavier de Maistre, Buffon, Corneille, Molière, Bocage, Antonio José da Silva, Shakespeare, Klopstock, and The Thousand Nights and a Night. Here's a chorus of voices and references for which Machado is the conductor, an encyclopedic collection of works that represents the repository of knowledge and literature as an art of what can be called universal writing. Machado took advantage of his developing library, his actual library, which increased over time to some 1,000 volumes, not only for research or reference, but also as a creative synthesis of authors and works revived, like Brás Cubas, from beyond the grave, that he incorporated into his prose. Brás Cubas pretends to be dead, where he subjected all of these found works to variations. A devourer of antecedents, Machado made sure he could best be understood through the world of writing. All of his novels are based on literary quotations. For the poet and essayist Haroldo de Campos, Machado's powers of assimilation were, quote, a complicated chemistry in which it was no longer possible to distinguish the assimilator from the material assimilated. He incorporated numerous historical literary genres and forms into his novels, and his last novel, Memorial de Iris, Counselor Iris' Memorial, even foregrounds its variable genres. Iris writes in his diary, if this were a novel, or if I were writing a novel. Epigraphs from late 13th century cantigas by João Zorro and Dom Denis, King of Portugal, confirm the allusions to medieval romance and the allegory of love, seen in the names of the main characters of Counselor Iris' Memorial, taken from opera and legend, which are Fidelia and Tristan. The many references that he extracted from a world library placed European books, as it were, into the hands of a Brazilian cannibal. His open world library anticipates Borges' idea in Biblioteca de Babel, which is from 1941, and André Malraux's Musée Imaginaire from 1947, by 60 years. He practiced techniques of composition that are now considered to be thoroughly contemporary because of their multiple combinations of reinvention and rewriting. It was the critic Agrippino Grieco who, more than anyone, cataloged Machado's literary sources, even going so far as to state that the author least present in his works was the Brazilian. Unlike Grieco, however, my thesis is that Machado's selective readings from a universal library, the many sources he subjected to variation, including theater and opera, make up his consciousness of world literature, which is his most distinguishing characteristic as a writer. Machado finds the universal in the particular. He creates dramatic tension by oscillating between comedy and tragedy, reason and madness, inclusion and alienation. In this way, each bit of his fictional world takes part in a greater totality. The incorporation of a Western canon in his works is an important part of this modernity and even of this originality. With an encyclopedic knowledge of text, perhaps inspired by Diderot, Machado focuses on books that were read or discussed by key intellectuals who guided his literary education, books he would incorporate into his fiction by using humor and satire as a counterpoint to direct narrative. He molded Bras Cubas's Delirium, for example, when Bras dreams of flying back to the origins of time on the back of a hippopotamus, from an idea found in Leopardi's Dialogue of an Icelander. He wrote comic variations on Hamlet, quote, "There are more things between heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed of in your vain dialectic." Or, "Between the palace of the Count of Arcos and Ovidor Street, there are more mouths than imagined by your useless statistics." The biographer Raimundo Magalhães called him a distorter of quotations. Here's a little quote about him. "He gave in to an irrepressible impulse and transferred to his manuscript first a passage from Coriolanus or from Shakespeare's Hamlet, then an idea of Pascal, or a verse by Molière, or Corneille, of Racine, of Boileau, of André Charnier, of Lamartine, Hugo, Musset, and so on, if not also from Dante, Shelley, or Longfellow. When he began to study German, he couldn't resist putting some verses by Goethe into a footnote to a chronicle, ending with a Latin quotation. Machado's first published play, Que as mulheres têm a pistolos, The Weakness That Women Have for Fools, from 1861, as we know, is a translation and adaptation to stage of a comedy, Victor Hainaut's De l'amour des femmes pour le sot, published in Paris in 1859, itself a work taken from Louis Champagne's Petit Traité de l'amour des femmes pour le sot from a few decades before. Machado's poem Minha Mãe, from 1855, dedicated to the memory of his mother, is based on a French translation of William Cowper's On the Receipt of My Mother's Picture from 1790, popularized in Brazil by Saint-Beuve. The 8 poems of Machado's Lida Chinesa, Chinese Lyre, from Calvinus, are a perfect example of a double transcreation, being a rewriting of free translations of classic Chinese poetry to French by Judith Gautier in her Le Livre de Jade, which she had based on translations that the Marquis d'Herviers Saint-Denis published in his Poésie de la Capitaine in Paris in 1862. Among other adaptations by Machado, we find The Raven of Poe, based on Baudelaire's translation, Hamlet's monologue, and the libretto from The Barber of Seville. Machado's dialogue with his library complements his keen observations of social and human life in Rio de Janeiro, which he then describes using references, allusions, translations, or quotations found in his larger library. Machado assimilates and transforms universal texts. The character Rubião in Quincas Borba thought he was the author of an imaginary library because he edited and corrected so many sentences that, quote, he ended up writing all the books that he read. Rubião's fantasy of universal authorship signals Machado's new approach to our universal literary heritage, which is one of critical devouring, humorously and satirically appropriating and consuming all the books. In the short story, O Cônego, o Metaphysical Estilo, the Canon or Metaphysics of Style, Canon Matthias prepares his sermon in a vast world of words and ideas unknown to him, in which remote voices resonate in a large chorus coming from sources as diverse as Plato, Spinoza, and St. Thomas Aquinas, although united to him by some unknown affinity. The canon attributed sex to the parts of speech, thus the nouns and adjectives were joined by force of their mutual attraction. They spoke of theology, philosophy, liturgy, geography, ancient and modern history, dogmas and syntax, all attracted to each other by natural laws of grammar and of procreation, eternally valid. Machado's library repeated that vast world of ancient voices in a kind of song of songs, whether harmonious or dissonant, as a repository of knowledge and experience. In Bras Cubas's theory of editions, life, like books, goes through different editions until the last one, which the author gives to the worms, free of charge. The worms to which Bras Cubas donates the final edition of life's books become unexpected allegorical actors in the library. Rascubus dedicates his memoirs to one of them who gnaws his corpse before finding others that devour books. Machado's reference is to Darwin's work on the creation of vegetable mold, read in London in 1837 and published in Worms, 1881, based on the work of geologist Charles Lyell, according to which nature is slowly modified by the beneficent action of worms, since every few years the soil literally passes through their bodies, evening it out and removing its inequalities. The fat reader worm that Rascubus consults is an actor in this comic cannibal allegory of smoothing and leveling, whose effects are applied to books. Quote, "My dear sir," says the worm, "we know absolutely nothing about the texts we read, nor do we choose them, nor love or detest what we read. We just eat them." Machado refers specifically to Darwin's book in the short story Un capítulo de chapéus, or a chapter of hats, from Historia Sem Data of 1884, when Conrad proposes to Mariana the theory that hats have metaphysics. Here's a short quote. "The metaphysical principle is the following. The hat completes the man. It is a complement to create ab eterno. No one can change it without self-mutilation. This is a profound matter, one that has never yet occurred to anyone. Wise men have studied everything from stars to worms, or to give you the bibliographical references, from Laplace onward. You've never read Laplace? From Laplace and his Mécanique Céleste to Darwin and his curious book about worms. Yet they've never thought to stop and look at a hat and study it from every angle. No one has noticed that there is metaphysics in hats." Unlike Darwin's worms, Machado practices a conscious and intentional bibliophagy, consuming, digesting, and altering the content of the pages as they are eaten. His bibliophagia can be considered a prelude or first version of Oswald Chendragi's Cannibal Manifesto, or anthropophagia, 4 decades later. Long before anthropophagia became a theory, Machado was devouring and assimilating Western books and ideas. The hundreds of references in Machado's prose, reflecting the oceanic dimensions of the Portuguese world of empire, is a counterpoint to local characters and settings, which are developed in the light of the great models and archetypes to which they belong. Could Machado be the father of the inventor of the open work of art, codified by Humberto Eco and Adolfo de Campos almost a century later? We are already in the presence of techniques of the modernist novel. Machado's works of fiction become vessels for a unique collection of sources and ideas that the author cites, alters, modifies, falsifies, and parodies. The creative rewordings, the constant presence of aphorisms, the subtle inferences and unreliable arguments of the narrator have the effects both of challenging accepted forms of narration and of disguising the author's methods. Machado creates chapters made up entirely of punctuation, like his dialogue between Adam and Eve, or the wording of a tombstone, as well as empty chapters that have titles but no content, such as Rascubus, How I Did Not Become a Minister of State. If Lawrence Sterne, in his novel Tristram Shandy, itself a model of hybridism cited by Rascubus, recalled and mixed numerous authors and their works with the purpose of making his novel inimitable, Machado faithfully followed his example by excerpting a world library in the city universe of Rio de Janeiro. That library, like the one transferred from Lisbon by Dom João VI in 1808, represents an inheritance and perhaps a late expression of the expansive transoceanic maritime Baroque in Brazil. The references that a world library make possible are essential in Machado's work to a full presentation of the psychology and motivation of the characters. In Dom Casmurro, for example, Bento Santiago, enchanted with the young girl Capitu and prepared to run a comb through her hair, feels the sensation of touching the head of a nymph, and he writes down the name Thetis, T-H-E-T-I-S, before quickly erasing it. Readers of Camões will recognize the name of the Nereid and sea nymph who is the great passion of the giant Adamastor. When Adamastor extended his arms to embrace her, she changed him into the gigantic rock of the Cape of Africa and continued to taunt him forever with her waves. That name, applied to Capitu in their first erotic moment, is one of Bento's subtle discharacterizations of her as a destructive femme fatale. Another fantasy of classical origin told by Bento in chapter 40 symbolizes unfaithfulness. He remembers having read in Tacitus about Iberian mares that could conceive by the wind. Soon his imagination becomes a mare ready to confess to his mother imagined acts of love with Capitu, a windswept idea that would have the advantage of disqualifying him for the priesthood, which he's been promised, at the same time that it associated Capitu with a kind of atmospheric pansexuality. The corollary of the theme is found in Vinto's accusation that the future son of his marriage to Capitu is an illegitimate stranger conceived by the wind. The presence of these references serves a critical function by revisiting their sources in world literature. Machado's social position allowed him to see the city of Rio de Janeiro from outside in and from inside out. He was kind of an inside-outsider and outside-insider. If some readers considered Machado to be an eccentric, that is, out of center, writing at the periphery of empire, there is no doubt that he found fame through the wide sea of letters in his world library. He traveled not only around his room, but around literature. The scope of his syntheses is obvious in the list of writers, French, English, Italian, Russian, and Portuguese, to whom he has been compared. His city universe is tragic and indifferent, like Thomas Hardy. He evokes the strange side of reality like Melville, Gogol, or Dostoevsky. His short stories unmask social conventions like Maupassant. His laconic narrators have the poetic quality of a Dickinson. The subconscious deceptions and conflicts of his characters bring to mind the social disintegration of a Chekhov. His psychological depths join the perversity of a Poe with the composure of Henry James. Perhaps in literature, there is, after all, little advantage in writing from the center of the capitalist world. By amending the sentence that opens the chapter, The Shopping Trip, from the novel Esau and Jacob, one can form a hypothesis about Machado's purpose in writing. Quote, Machado would not have written his works if they were truly about shopping trips or social relations, but they are not. To the contrary, Machado found his subjects in literature. Verses of Shakespeare, Dante, and Goethe, from Sterne to Flaubert, in the Peninsular Lyric, Camões, Bernardino Ribeiro, Almeida Garrett. He brought together diverse genres, from oral tradition, biblical or moral text, aphorisms and proverbs, satire and irony, dramatic comedy, memoirs, Bildungsroman, and the philosophical essay. He studied classics in their original languages. It could be said that he himself became his library. At the age of 58, he co-founded the Brazilian Academy of Letters, bequeathing his world of letters to the nation. In an 1867 chronicle, Machado declared that he loved and believed in books. With the passing decades, he collected a considerable library in his bungalow in the Cosme Velho district of Rio. There he could live and write between paper and his imagination alone, just as Borges would do in the district of Recoleta in Buenos Aires a few decades later, as described by Maria Kodama. Quote, it was truly a library of Babel, full of old books, full of notes in his tiny handwriting. At times, like Borges, I ask myself, what is real? The world I see from the window, bathed in the splendor of the afternoon sun, or the library of Babel, with shelves full of the books that his hands once touched. End of quote. Arnold de Campos proposed that the world's library of Alexandria could have been rebuilt by bringing together three libraries of authors of the Americas: the Capella of Alfonso Reyes in Mexico City, Mario Gendrati's library on Lopez Chavez Street in Sao Paulo, and that of Losama Lima's old house in Havana. We could now include the Real Gabinete Portuguese de Leitura, the Royal Portuguese Reading Room, where Machado read, and that continues to serve readers in Rio de Janeiro. Even with the loss of part of Machado's library after his death, scholar Jean-Michel Massa cataloged 723 books, representing 11 areas of knowledge: Greek, Latin, the Bible and theology, Orientalism, general history, philosophy, psychology, and Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, English, German, French, and Brazilian literatures. For Machado, the life of books is parallel to human life. Quote, this is from one of his chronicles. It is enough to remember that the life of books is as variable as that of men. Some die at 20, others at 50, others at 100, or 99. With the turn of the century, many can be found in libraries from where they will go part into history and part into anthologies. Well, that prolonging of life, whether short or long, is a shred of glory. Immortality itself belongs only to a few. Books symbolize the beginning, the genesis or regeneration of thought and of life. With this idea in mind, Machado revitalized world literature thanks to libraries, with readings extending from art and philosophy to the eternal truths about humanity and existence. Machado created his own world literature, resisting the corrosive effects of time and customs, and thus in 50 years of writing, he managed to communicate to us his accumulated knowledge of personal experience and the ideas that formed his worldview. He had no illusions that the truths woven into his writings would have any transformative effect on his readers or on human nature. However, he was aware and confident of the value and virtue of his works as art and philosophy, and of their status as major contributions to the World Library. Thank you.
Can we open for questions?
Of course, questions. Yes, Sue, please.
Thanks, David. I really loved it. I have a question. I don't know about his other sources from him except for what you just said. Does he mention Antonio de Guevara at all? Spanish writer, beginning of the 16th century. He also
he mentions
distorted quotes like that.
there's a lot of presence of Calderon,
Okay.
but I think mostly it's Portuguese literature from that place. I mean, Cervantes and Calderon are definitely mentioned. Guevara, I'm not so sure. I have to look.
And I'm not
I
sure
don't know if there's an
Portuguese.
index of his complete works to and chronicles to find out. But,
Okay. Thanks.
certainly Calderon, because he worked a lot with theater in early days, and even translated some of Calderon. And Cervantes, of course, all over from
In his letter correspondence, was he in correspondence with any of the authors from the continent?
Only Essa de Queiroz, and it was sort of a hands-off rivalry. One critic mentions that one of the characteristics of Machado, and perhaps of his success, or other reasons, he had basically no competition in Brazil from 1880 until 1908 when he was writing. No real competition, but his competition was Essa de Queiroz. Right? And Machado in 1878 wrote an absolutely crushing review, damning review of Cousin Basilio, of the Essa's novel that came out the same year. Then after that, they're very aware of each other. So the thing about the correspondence is that it's just been published. Sergio Paulo Gourmet from the Academy of Letters, Brazilian Academy of Letters, it's just published in 5 volumes, the correspondence. So, now's a good time for some researcher. And in fact, Ambassador Rene was telling me this summer that a bit of chagrin that the 5th volume had just come out and they discovered another letter. An unknown letter had come up. So, I don't know what's going to happen. Yes, please.
Well, just in terms of the breadth of Machado's World Library, how many languages did he read?
Well, mostly French was
Mostly
his main
French.
language.
Yeah.
And a lot of the other translation he did was through French, although it would seem that he must have known Italian quite well,
Right.
because the Leopardi source for the Delirium would have come on very early 1881. And then German he obviously studies, and his great reliance on Faust comes out in the last novel. So Tristan, Isolde, opera, Goethe, everything is, we can see perhaps the weight of his studies of German by the last part of his life, but his main other language is French. And so he translated French stage comedies in the 1850s and 60s. He translated a novel of Victor Hugo, Portuguese. And he also translated a novel of Dickens, but undoubtedly through French translation. So I guess, if you're an up-and-coming writer without funds, you accept these big translations, right, to survive. And of course, it wasn't really until his marriage to Carolina in 1869 that he had a fairly stable job and financial position. And perhaps it's for that reason, they moved 3 or 4 times after that until they finally end up in this bungalow on the Cosme Velho Street, which is more like a coven, where we don't really know anything about any details of their life for the 34 years of their married life there. Yes, Professor Ador.
Very much. Given that I started reading Machado and your research, how did you decide to combine into so many pages what you like to say? Tell us about
Well, I did have to eliminate 250 pages, which was oversized. But, the Machado, the bibliography of 1955 is immense. So just to think of looking at a bibliography of Machado, you spend the rest of your life and never finish. So the first 2 years was basically trying to decide how to approach the subject and what to do, and whether there was some new idea there or not. So it'll be for readers to decide whether I've been successful, but I did focus a bit on the theater, the influence of the theater in his early life and music, on the delirium scene, and on one of the main metaphors, which is the life as an opera, right, between God and the devil. So those have been identified as the 3 iconic moments of Machado by Benedicto Nunes, not only a friend of mine, but a philosopher of Brazil and so forth. So I took Benedicto's from his article on philosophy and Machado de Assis, and did that. And then the idea that my approach was taking the last so-called mature novels, the posthumous memoirs of Ras Cubas and and then the Counselor Artist 2 novels, and concentrating on the fact that the characters are also the authors of those novels. Machado de Assis is not the author of any of his major novels. Right? So this is a very interesting approach, and talking about modern fiction and so forth to work out. So I have a section of the book called The Author Narrators, right? Which is the idea of various forms of narrative displacement in having the character write the book. Yes.
Thank you so much. This was just a joy. This was a wonderful day.
Well, you're a librarian.
So, 19th century novel. In knowing Machado's works as you do, when you looked through the inventory of his library, was there any aha moments for you, or was there anything that maybe surprised you of the contents?
No, he's pretty, if you look through the novels, there's so many names. You're just drowned. There's a particular edition, the Brasiliense edition from the 70s, that has notes, and all the names are in the notes. Like 400 notes to each novel of all of the names that he's dropped. So I don't think there's any particular surprising moment except just the breadth of his reading, but also the subtle way that he incorporates it, like the Tetis reference. Very subtle. Things that pop up later. And Machado loves to say, as the reader will remember from chapter 23, oh my God, chapter 23! So the playfulness with the reader is yet another chapter where Machado is taking advantage of his situation above the mere readers and playing with them. And playfulness is something that can't be forgotten. Even though these books have to do with very serious themes, it's all a play. It's all an opera. It's all a work of entertainment. So those two sides, tragic comedy and tragic juxtaposed, help to give this sort of samba or tension. In the same way that Machado, born in these circumstances that one would have never thought that he would become a major writer, practically impossible, yet becomes a decorated, the greatest intellectual of his age. So there's how you can see the city while you're wearing your medal from the Emperor down at a single, or you can see it from the perspective of your parents who were servants on an estate. Right? So he really did have a comprehensive view of the society that I would think that very few other people had, because of his rapid, what should I say, rise in education as an author, right? From an origin of difference. But I think it was a complete transformation, and when you see Machado, who's Machado here, he's a member of the elite circle of empires, absolutely not about it. And opening my book, there's a photo from 1903, a meeting of a literary group called a little club, and there he is with his spectacles and all the other gentlemen of ambassadors and so forth around. And I make the comment that little could they expect that here was a destabilizer of systems, a great ironist in their midst. And one of the most interesting quotes I found was that the rest of them, while they knew that Machado was an ironist and satirist, they found his comments agreeable, let's say satirically agreeable, and took it in that light rather than seeing, let's say, any of the lower depths, right, to which he was going to, as it were, condemn the society of his day.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you all for
Thank you.
coming.